Professor Byard is a forensic pathologist and the Marx Chair of Pathology at the University of Adelaide. Now, he's had quite an interesting time. After qualifying in medicine, he took 5 years of clinical practice in flying doctor work in the Northern Territory, and he trained and qualified in family practice and then studied physical and medical anthropology in Canada. There aren't many doctors that can say that. He's then trained in pathology and has published more than 1,000 chapters, papers, peer-reviewed letters and manuscripts, and he's written 11 textbooks in the field. He's also editor-in-chief of Forensic Science, Medicine and Pathology, and he's going to share with you about his career, the ups and the downs, I suspect, and being a clinician-scientist. Professor Byard.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's interesting, so many people here on Saturday mornings. You clearly don't have lives. But that's probably a bit of a pejorative judgment. This is now the shallow end of the gene pool, I'm afraid, forensics. So what I want to do is I want to just natter a bit about what forensic pathology is and isn't, how I got there. The cases have been most interesting and emotionally challenging. I'm going to talk about bushrangers and convicts because I like doing that. My standard research activities, you can see those on PubMed and Google Scholar. Now, I've done a lot of work on SIDS and child safety. One of the most exciting developments, I think, in SIDS was working with Hannah Kinney at Harvard recently, and we discovered why babies are at risk, certain babies, when they sleep face down, why they're at risk of SIDS, because they have very low substance P levels in parts of the brainstem that control head and neck movement. So we've actually shown the reason they don't lift their heads is because they can't. But we're going a bit off the grid. I'm going to tell you about stuff that's not on PubMed. My first court case was a stabbing, and I knew everything about stab wounds. I was a genius. And then they asked me, can you tell the court what forensic pathology is? And I just sort of looked at them and thought, well, no, actually, I've never really thought about it. So now I know. And every court case, you're asked the same question, and you say, forensic pathology is the study of injury and disease and how it applies to the law, and on and on and on. It is so boring. There's more to forensic pathology than dating non-existent injuries, than endlessly discussing an alleged time of death. Witless silence, death occurred at 2 minutes past midnight, yeah, plus or minus a week, really. Or constantly dealing with these bizarre hypotheses that lawyers come up with in the pubs over lunch. My God, I'm good. You know why court cases take so long? Because they're getting $5,000 a minute. We will never get that. My background, I grew up in Tasmania. That's a map showing the relative importance of Tasmania compared to the mainland. You can only buy that in Tasmania. I grew up in Wynyard, a little town with Table Cape, Fossil Bluff. That's my great-great-grandparents marking their graves. One of my great-great-uncles put a pigsty over it at the farm, and it's still a scandal we don't talk about in the family. I was sentenced to South Australia about 30 years ago. That's South Australia. I actually quite like it now. Those are the hills are about 20 feet high. South Australians have an interesting perspective. Universities down here, forensic science is in the gloom. That's the old cricket oval. Now, my ex-wife's Canadian, and when we came out, I showed her a cricket match, and she glazed over and looked at me. I said, what is it? She said, Roger, it's like baseball on Valium. I actually agree. So, my career, medicine, University of Tasmania, sometime in the last century, postgraduate training in Canada, paediatric pathology Adelaide, forensic pathology Adelaide, professor of pathology Adelaide. Clearly my career has been going downhill steadily for years. Now for the medical students in the audience, I like this. This is the hierarchy of medicine. It just gives you a bit of a guide where you should go. If you're crazy with a significant attention span, psychiatry is perfect. If you don't have an attention span, emergency medicine, where I wanted to go. If you're sane, very hard-working but horrible, clearly surgery. I see more patients killed by surgeons than I do meningococcal disease, trust me. If your attitude doesn't matter, patients asleep, anesthesia, patients dead, pathology. We get a very bad rap, actually. People say we're sometimes right, but we're always too late. And even God doesn't like pathologists. Look at this. He that touches the dead body of any man shall be unclean for 7 days. Based on the thousands of cases I've autopsied, I'm going to be filthy for 3 centuries, I think. Now, I did an elective as a student in the Highlands of New Guinea. When I showed the technicians this picture, they said, which one are you? which clearly I've lost the hair, and I've also lost the desire to climb limestone cliffs. But we had an incredible time. We used to go out to villages to do clinics on bridges like that, past ancestor shrines like that. It was a very interesting part of my career. Then I did flying doctor work based in Nhulunbuy. That's the Nomad aircraft, flying coffins. My job was to actually look out the window to make sure the wheels had come down before we landed, and that's true. But the alternative there is to drive in the wet, and that's obviously very difficult. I was going to do emergency medicine, but I spent too long snorkeling in Belize, so by the time I got back to Canada, there were no jobs available. So my pathology career has actually been a mistake. One of the things you get to do at the university is give workshops overseas. I've given workshops in 34 countries. Those are not University of Adelaide medical students. They're forensic pathologists in Kazakhstan, and it went as well as it looks. We butted heads for 2 hours. They disagreed with everything I said, but you do learn stuff when you go to countries, unusual countries. They said to me at the end of it, in your country, if the court disagrees with your opinion, are you prosecuted? I said, no. And they said, oh, you have a very good system. Duh. So we sometimes don't realize how lucky we are. What do forensic pathologists do? Well, we perform autopsies, we examine the dead, we go to death scenes, we go to court. Autopsies haven't changed all that much. That's a medieval setting, opening the abdomen. When I was in Thailand with the army, 2 people walked past wearing robes like that, and in the other direction, 2 big, blonde fellows with black underpants and black gumboots walked the other way. And nobody responded. I said, the Spanish Inquisition went in that direction, the gay Mardi Gras went in that direction. Who are these people? Dutch pathologists, and the Austrian pathologists actually still wear those clothes. Now, we are doing postmortem CTs, so we have made it a bit more sophisticated, and that's a vehicle accident victim, and you can demonstrate fractures much better with postmortem CT than I could on dissection. We can also put soft tissue back, and we examine all cases. Now, dentures should be in your mouth, not your throat. Elderly man in a nursing home, obviously choked on his dentures. Why bother with an autopsy? I want to make sure that he wasn't choked by another patient or a nurse and swallowed his dentures. So there's always a point to an autopsy. Now, I don't know whether I can make this spin. No, I can't. Damn it. That is actually a seal skull. I do a veterinary pathology work, and it should rotate, but this was a seal that came into the facility and just died, and the CT showed multiple fractures here. It obviously hit a boat. And when you deflesh the skull, of course, you lose all of that. So CTs can be used in animal work as well. What about forensics on television? CSI, Witless Silence, McCallum. I mean, who looks like that? He's obviously got too much hair. And as for this woman, why don't I ever smile? I'm with him. I hate her. I really do. Whenever I want to get irritated, I watch the program because she always gets it wrong. The only one that's any good, does anybody watch Inspector Rex? Fantastic. That's a B-grade police drama from Vienna. Rex solves all the crimes. So I have police friends in Vienna, and I was going to get a picture of me like that. And I was taken to the dog facility. And I was holding the superintendent's hand, and that thing, cross between my 2 favourite Austrians, Schwarzenegger and Hitler, launched itself at the cage. And I said, I don't like this animal. He said, it's very astute. It's bitten its trainer twice this week. I said, well, why don't you shoot it? Because he had a gun. He said, because this is what we want. I said, but it's not a German Shepherd. And he just looked at me and said, German Shepherds? Weak. So even Inspector Rex is not right. Now, moving on to, sorry to break that to you. Unusual cases. I suppose the strangest case was the Snowtown serial killings. It was my first week on call at forensics. On Thursday night, I got a call from head of major crime. I'm in a little bank vault in Snowtown. It's lined by plastic. There are drums. I said, oh, is it hydroponic? He said, doesn't smell like it. And I said, He said, do you want to come up? And I said, oh, not really. I was watching Father Brown or something important. And he said, what do I do? And I said, literally, take the lid off, and if you find a foot, give us a call back. And 10 minutes later, he said, I found 2 feet. And those were the barrels. Now, what university do you think the student went to who labelled those? Not Monash or Melbourne, I can tell you. But you've got 6 barrels, and there were 8 bodies in there. Those are all the victims who were in the barrels. These were the perpetrators. Jimmy Vlassakis gave police evidence. Wagner and Bunting are in jail forever. One of them wanted to get parole a couple of years ago, and the judge thought, not a good idea. They were involved in torturing their victims. They were involved in cannibalism, which hasn't been really played up in the media. They were tortured to reveal their Centrelink and banking details. They recorded statements. They played it back to people to convince them they were still alive. It was all very complex, but really stupid. I mean, with this, they were driving around the countryside with a trailer with the barrels on the back, and their friends were saying, "What is that smell?" And they were saying, "Oh, it's dead kangaroos." Right? So, a very odd case. I didn't know what I'd done going from paediatric pathology to that. A very sad case was a young girl called Sam. She was 15. She's lying there. She was raped and strangled, and her body was dumped. I always take a lot of swabs, DNA swabs. Doesn't matter if they're negative. If you get a positive, that's great. I got a positive. The police were going to test the people around the district. The perpetrator tried to kill himself, failed, and then turned himself in. He was her sporting coach, and he'd actually gone up to her father in front of people when this had occurred and put his arms around him and said, "Oh, mate, I'm so sorry." Why do I like golden retrievers? Because what you see is what you get. But we don't undress bodies at the scene because you might lose evidence. Now, say we didn't have the DNA. What have I got here? That's under her underpants. That's a tuft of carpet from the back of his car, and those are paint flakes from the back doorstep at his house. So we've got 2 very good pieces of evidence linking her body to his house and car. So I think we had him anyway. Difficult cases are the mass deaths. The Bali bombings, that's Leggy in the street. The bomb went off and took out the Sari Club and the one opposite, and then the Paddy's Bar was further up the road. That was in October 2002. A lot of dead and wounded people, a lot of problems encountered. It was an offshore disaster. There were very limited local resources and limited control at the time and subsequently. I was watching the news when it happened, and you could see people sweeping up in the club. That's not what you do. With a crime scene, you want to preserve it, so you put a boundary around it. You let only a few people in. You find evidence, you photograph it, you preserve it, and you validate it. I have found this on this floor at this time. I write the date and the time, I sign and seal it, and then I take it to the lab, so we know exactly how it's got there. There were 10,000 pieces of evidence in Snowtown. If we didn't have chain of custody, they would have been worthless. Those were the local facilities in Denpasar. That's the cooling unit, and we had room for 8 bodies. There were 202 bodies. That's 200 murder victims and 2 suicides. The bodies were incomplete. They were traumatized. Secondary projectiles occur with an explosion. So there was a cast iron and glass between the bomb and the people in the nightclub. That shattered and then went into the club. The bodies were burnt and, of course, very decomposed in the tropics. I'm going through a pile of floor sweepings, looking for human remains and ordnance. If I can find a piece of the bomb, it might identify the bombers. How far do you go with DNA? The Americans went to that with the World Trade Center. Why do you do that? Well, if that's the only piece that's left, they've got something to bury, and they also know the person was there. The problem is commingling, and I always say if I detonated the bomb here, the front row would turn into me with all of the... And then I make a rude comment saying it's probably an improvement, but that's unfair. But you commingle remains, body fluids spread around, so pure DNA identification at mass killings like that is very difficult. The tsunami, Operation Cordor, that was the earthquake, 26th of December 2004, 9 on the Richter scale. There were many hundreds of thousands of victims in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and around Phuket there were about 4,000 victims and about 1,500 Caucasians. That's where the epicenter was. Malaysia was protected by Banda Aceh, went over to Sri Lanka. The Burmese government said they had 8 deaths and they didn't allow any foreigners in. So clearly there were a lot more who died, but they just, the military government didn't want people looking. That's Patong Beach the day before, and that's the day after. And you can see how dangerous the work is. I mean, that's splintered wood and nails and corrugated iron. There are human bodies and animal bodies, and there's sewage. You know, a small cut can get infected very quickly. It doesn't take very long to turn Battery Point in Hobart into that. And I think we've all seen images of the tsunami. The first site I worked at was Wat Nyan Yao. The Thais would bring bodies into temples, and the Buddhist monks would wander around at night chanting, helping the spirits of the dead on their path. Didn't matter what religion or ethnicity they were. So people I met who had lost family members, I could assure them that the Thais were looking after the bodies very well. So there was a couple of thousand bodies near Kalak. They turned over every day. It was just a constant a stream of bodies. The Thais managed very well. They put up photographs of the bodies, and people would come and look at sort of teeth shape, ear shape, any jewellery. They also gave them DVDs to take home. But it was quite emotionally stressful. And that's one of the things about forensics. It's not easy. That little boy, his blue eyes still haunt me how many years later. You know that his parents probably never got him back, and even if they did, he would never have been as he was. Bodies just coming in day after day in trucks. Just in my last week, I had to go to a couple of containers that hadn't been refrigerated for 4 weeks to find a couple of Australian bodies. These were 2 volunteers. You can see I'm not particularly happy with them. I called them Bill and Ben, the flower pot men, because they kept on walking into each other, and they were like zombies. And then I found out that they were firemen who just volunteered from England. They'd never seen dead bodies, and they ended up at a container in Thailand with me. So they left a day or two later, but I don't know whether they got counselling or whatever happened. The Thais decided to celebrate the spirits of the dead, so they had this big celebration with the monks, the Westerners in the honoured position. Everybody had a candle in a bottle, and then they let rice lanterns go. And the rice lanterns, each one represented the spirit of one of the dead people. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It filled the sky. It was like the Milky Way. So you would go from that to that. And if you compare different disaster victim identification exercises, Bali, fragmented, but only enough deceased to be on 2 whiteboards. In Thailand, they filled the sky. Now, bushrangers. I'm going to talk about bushrangers. A couple of things about bushrangers. Robin Hood did not steal from the poor and keep it for himself. And I think murdering serving police officers is not a good thing. I know Australia, parts of Australia, adore this person. He's a classic sociopath. He was a pathological liar, had a parasitic lifestyle, and he didn't say such is life. So if you have a Ned Kelly tattoo, I'd get it rewritten. Actually, he just said, "Ah, well." The reason I got involved in this is because of Lawless. It was a Foxtel series. Mike Munro was the compere, Adam Ford, the archaeologist, Keira Lindsay, the historian. It started off with one of Ned Kelly's victims' great-great-grandchildren, son, Leo Kennedy, who was talking to people about what it's like to go to his great-great-grandfather's grave and find Kelly memorabilia. We celebrate the perpetrators, not the victims. There's something wrong with this country, with our psyche, I believe. And then Mike, interestingly enough, his great-great-uncle was the last person to be hung in Queensland as a bushranger. So we had this sort of story going through the whole series. Ben Hall, 19th century bushranger, shot and killed by colonial police on May the 5th. We all agree on that. Very dapper. He used to wear a bow tie. He operated around Forbes. Has anybody here been to Forbes? You must go. It makes the rest of Australia look great. The only decent restaurant is the Ben Hall Bow Tie, B-A-U tie. The food's better than the joke. But there's a bit of a dispute about Ben. His CV was quite impressive. He and Frank Gardner robbed the Gold Escort coach, got the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's currency. Over the next 2 years, they committed hundreds of robberies, and his gang killed 2 police officers. Everybody's heard of Ben Hall and Ned Kelly. Who's heard of Constable Nelson? A man just trying to do his job. The popular version of events is in the street of Forbes. He was hunted from his station like a dog shot down. Riddled like a sieve was valiant Ben Hall. It was early in the morning when the 7 police surrounded him. As fast asleep he lay. So the legend is that he was just murdered by the police. The police version, not unusually, is a bit different. They said they were waiting for him, called out on him to stop. He didn't. They peppered him with buckshot, and then he was shot by Constable Hipkiss. And the shot went through his belt. So we thought, well, let's have a look at the belt. It's in the Powerhouse Museum. And I said, I don't think that looks like a bullet hole. It just looks like a broken belt. But I put the edges together. Nobody had ever done that. And I was just astounded. There it is, an oval defect. It's shelving. The only position you could achieve that is behind and to the left where hip kiss was supposed to be standing. So we did scanning electron microscopy on it. We took bits from the front of the belt, put it through the machine. It was clean, so there's no contamination with hands. The ammunition pouch was full of lead. The bullet hole had lead as well as 19th century accelerants, so it was a bullet hole. That is scanning EM. That's a bit of the bullet that killed Ben Hall. And there it is, lead. So what we proved there using modern techniques is that the police version was correct, and he was shot through and through by hip kiss. Now, Ned Kelly, the Iron Outlaw, that's Stringy Bark Creek in Victoria, where he murdered 3 police officers. It's a very eerie place, actually. That's the monument to the police officers, which has often Kelly memorabilia on it. We decided to test his gun. That's a replica of his gun, a horrible thing. It had no sights. The only way to be accurate with that is to shoot it a lot. Kelly protagonists will say, well, he put a cross in his bullets. So one bullet would give you a number of holes, so he didn't shoot as often as he was supposed to. Well, we thought that was rubbish, but we decided to test it. And on a pig carcass, actually, it's interesting that Adam it's the same colour as the pig. I don't know the reason for that, but we did find that the bullet did split. All right, so one bullet can make 2 holes. Why is he scoring his bullets? He's making dum-dum bullets. They're illegal internationally. They make a terrible mess when they hit you. So, okay, we'll give it to you that it can split, but the reason it's splitting is because it's a very awful weapon. Now, does anybody have Ned Kelly tattoos? Nobody ever says yes. I was just interested. I was looking over the years, and I've realised that people with Ned Kelly tattoos die very badly. And this was a retrospective study. This is in a forensic context, not in the community. So if you have, those of you who are hiding your Ned Kelly tattoos, just, you'll be okay as long as you don't come to me. But 40% suicides, 35% accidents, 10% homicides. So it was criticised as being retrospective, so I just did a prospective study. Every time one came in, I just noted it down. And again, it's interesting that we've got 73% unnatural deaths. Again, suicides, accidents, and homicides. In fact, if you work it out, you've almost got 3 times the suicide rate in the general population and almost 10 times the homicide rate. So the message is, Kelly tattoos are bad. I like that. Aren't they? They're the eyes of a university administrator, aren't they? My advice to you, and this is probably the most important thing I can say, is never, ever make eye contact and never turn your back. No. He was a misfit involved in a shootout with the police at Wandabadgery, and 2 bushrangers were shot dead. Constable Webb Bowen later died of his wounds. Moonlight and Rogan were hung in Darlinghurst Jail a few months later. The reason I find that amusing is because Rogan was hiding under the bed. He didn't actually fire a shot, but obviously the courts didn't like him, so they hung him. But the question is, who did the shooting? So Adam scratched around and found where the farmhouse was in the kitchen. I reviewed the forensic pathology, we did a ballistics analysis, and we used a LiDAR. Have you ever come across a LiDAR? It's a box that fires tens of thousands of laser beams. It integrates them, and you can recreate scenes. We use it at crime scenes. One that I was amazed at. I didn't go to the scene. The cop took me in through the front door, into the lounge room, lightened it so I could see the body, and then he went up through the roof like a drone. And that is Wandabadgery. That's our tent. That is all dried sheep manure, and it's 40 degrees. It's disgusting. That's Monash at the cave, where it's been reconstructed. 22 degrees, lattes, very nice. But you can tip it and you can move around it, and you can take off vegetation. Steve, the director, is pointing out where the farmhouse is, and they've just taken all the vegetation out of it so you can repopulate it with who was there. So we've got 3 of the bushrangers couldn't actually see Webb Bowen. Rogan's hiding under the bed, all the good that it did him. Moonlight's going backwards and forwards, and Gus Warnicki is lying there. So Gus had been shot through the chest. I'm just showing Mike that's gone through his liver and his spine, paralysed, at least from the waist down. He can still use his arms, though. And so really the only contender in the shooting was Gus Warnicki, who was 15 years old and he died at the scene. So we have been able to show that Moonlight wasn't the shooter, but he was still responsible, clearly. Bit of historical stuff, going to Van Diemen's Land. Tasmania is a long way away from everywhere. There's brilliant records of the convicts held in Hobart. They're on the UNESCO World Heritage listing. It details everything, every punishment. Who would rather compare solitary confinement with flogging? Who'd rather solitary confinement? Who'd rather flogging? Who's awake? No. Solitary confinement is much worse than flogging. This is an example of the books that are written, and we've been looking at suicides, homicides, where the women were working, where the children were. Interesting thing though, you think going to Van Diemen's Land would be terrible. This is a plot of mortality. That's the Tasmanian mortality compared to English and US jails. Why is that? Because they were working outside, they got more meat in a day than these people would get in a year, and they're an economic resource. You know, they were building things, so people kept them alive. So, you know, you had a chance of surviving. If you behaved badly, they would take you to Devil's Island, which is on the west coast of Tasmania. That's Hell's Gates. That's the penitentiary there. And there was cannibalism. And we looked at it. It's interesting. A lot of the convicts were Irish. The basic tenet of British law is innocent until proven Irish. But he was Irish, sentenced to 7 years transportation. He arrived in Hobart Town. And then he embezzled 2 turkeys and 3 ducks. I don't know how you embezzle a duck, but he did that and was sentenced to Macquarie Harbour. And then he decided to escape with 7 of his mates. They were tree cutting. They decided it was time to leave. Unfortunately, there's not much, well, there is food, but not normal food. So they decided to survive by eating each other. Finally, Greenhill and Pearce were the only ones left, and if you fell asleep, then that was the end of you. So the categories of cannibalism: nutritional, which this is, ritual, and pathological. He confessed. He was caught and confessed to the magistrate, who said these were depraved lies. Only started at 10. So I'm only talking for half an hour? Oh, I thought I had 40. Okay. Yep. All right, I'll get through this. Anyway, 2 months later, he absconded with another young succulent convict and was caught and hung in Hobart Jail. So he is an opportunistic serial cannibal. So that's a different category of cannibalism. I'm a registered expert with the International Criminal Court. There has been dispute about Srebrenica, where you've got Bosnian troops surrounded by Serbians. They broke out, 12,000 left, 7,000 arrived. There are 5,000 soldiers missing, but the common thought is that it's genocide and these were all civilians. My point with this, and we did a 1,000-page report, is that it's a massacre and a war crime, but if you've got 5,000 civilians in the graves, where are the 5,000 soldiers? However, that created a lot of furor, and my dog, who is the only one who pays any attention to me, I'm telling her that every true genius is bound to be naive, and she thinks I'm an idiot. Isolated Indigenous communities, we do get bodies from Aboriginal centres. What happens is when they die in the APY lands, they move into sorry camps, where the old men decide what is going on. Unfortunately, they've been waiting for our autopsy reports. I talked to the old men up at Umawa, and we do a provisional autopsy report, which is unique internationally, and we put this on the report. No sticks, stones, bones, or other foreign objects were found to implicate another individual in the death. So we say there's no physical evidence of sorcery. That helps them tremendously because they can make early decisions. So a very small change in our practice means that things can be wound up quickly. That's my Aboriginal name, Galamay. My totemic animal is the pelican. I won't talk about the veterinary forensic pathology in the interest of time. I will talk about human rights issues. I've been working with Navpreet Kaur, who's a human rights lawyer in India, and we have studied acid attacks, child labour, dowry deaths, honour killings. Acid attacks are particularly nasty. There are assaults where acid is thrown over another person to maim, disfigure, or kill them. Navpreet has written a book on it. She and Laxmi, an acid attack survivor, work together. This is Neetu. She is promoting a film. She came to Australia and I had the privilege of meeting her. We think heroes in Australia are spotty individuals who kick a couple of goals. They have a cafe that they run, Shiro's Cafe in Agra, where they front the cafe. And after about half an hour, you don't see the scars on her. I've looked at death by sorcery, crucifixion, spontaneous human combustion, all sorts of strange things. But the point is that forensic pathology has no boundaries, but it can clarify questions on current and historical cases. I think you've got to have curiosity and compassion. How do we deal with death? Well, that's my front. No, it's not my front room. That's a church in the Czech Republic. I think the Buddhists have it right, actually. I want to dedicate this talk to the memory of Jasmine Kaur. She's a young Punjabi woman who died in 2021. She was kidnapped by her ex-boyfriend, put in the boot of a car for 5 hours, and then she was buried, and that's us exhuming the grave, and he actually buried her alive. So evil does exist, and that's the face of it. And that case haunts me. It is the most dreadful way to die. She knew exactly what was happening. So, as I said, forensics does have its burden. You have to be resilient. There's no escaping from death, but I think we can learn from it. And I think we are the guardians of the dead. Thank you. I'm afraid I don't think my eyes are as beady as that, are they? Actually, don't be honest.
I think it's showing your wisdom. That was extraordinary. Thank you. I'm sure that we'll have some questions in the audience. Do you all want to be forensic pathologists now? I think we can see how much curiosity one requires. There's some questions. Yeah, George.
After the episode in Kazakhstan, a couple of students came up and I said, "You're going to be forensic pathologist?" And they said, "After what we've seen today, never."
George.
Thank you, Professor Byard, for that enlightening talk. I guess my question was, as a medical student, as many people in this room, it can be a bit difficult to see where our careers might take us, and yours certainly took an interesting turn. Reflecting back, can you think of any sort of pivotal moments, maybe in your early career, that maybe directed you into where you are now?
As I said, it was generally a mistake. I was going to do third world medicine. I think if Médecins Sans Frontières had been around, that's what I would have gotten into, but it wasn't at the time. What I did in training in family practice, I did a whole lot of things: psychiatry, general practice rotations, gynecology, pediatrics. So I exposed myself to a whole lot of different areas. And I was an ICU registrar for a while, and I was getting very sick of hurting people. Bringing 80-year-old people into ICU and keeping them alive for 3 weeks in agony. I don't see that there's much joy in that. And so I was actually going to do anthropology, get out of it, and then fell into pathology, and then realised that pathology, and then particularly forensic pathology, it covers the whole of medicine. That's the exciting thing about it. I mean, everybody says their area is the best area, but we go from accidents, suicides, any organic disease, any tumour that you can imagine, ends up with us. We don't understand what they are, but we ask a responsible adult. So I think it's just it's constantly hypothesis testing. When I moved from the Children's Hospital to forensics, my clinical colleague said, "Oh, you'll die. It's boring. Nothing goes on." It's always hypothesis testing. Little old man drops dead mowing the lawn. Hypothesis, it's a heart attack, might not be. If you look at hospital medicine, you get a specimen from the theatre, you look at your book, oh, it's a hand.
Other questions? Yes, at the back there. Do you want to run down with the microphone, please? Anyone else?
I still haven't had a Ned Kelly fan attack me in a forum. It's just so disappointing. I mean, I've provoked and provoked.
They're no longer alive, that's the problem.
No, they are. They're everywhere. I had a young bloke for Lawless. He was actually getting a Kelly tattoo, and he was weeping when he talked about him. Oh, yeah.
Please.
Hello, Roger. This is Nella. Thank you so much. It was very engaging and very fun to listen to you. You touched very briefly about joy. What kind of joys do you get from doing this job?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the pathologists are very lucky compared to, say, the mortuary attendants, because the mortuary attendants are just processing bodies, whereas what we're doing is we're trying to work out what's happened. You know, I like dissecting, so I like actually laying out tissues and trying to see what's there. We've now got the CT, so we can bring that in. But there's a tremendous joy, I think, in getting a whole lot of unconnected data and working out a theme, which is why I like writing. To me, writing actually gives me the biggest joy. You know, start at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, work my way through to midnight almost, just trying to work out what the importance of this is. And there's an area of medicine, I call it preventive pathology, that I've invented. It's basically taking lessons from the mortuary back to the community. Clinicians often criticise us. They say, you know, oh, that's ridiculous. You can't. Your cause of death is wrong. And I've just written a commentary on clinico-pathological discordance, saying, well, clinicians see patients who have symptoms and signs. We see patients who don't. So they're a completely different population. So just because somebody has no symptoms and signs does not mean that they might not have this disease. But then working out the severity of the disease, underlying factors, what's real, what did COVID, did they die with it or from it? You know, there's just a constant intellectual challenge. That's where the joy comes, I think.
And my last question is about law. In your career journey, have you encountered examples that you found that your own human rights was in danger? For instance, having kind of a conflict with police in terms of finding truth, the truth that you thought that's your truth, but the truth for the police or other investigators would be different.
No, look, we're, as I said, we're very lucky that we're encouraged to take as much time as we want and to come up with a reasonable argument. And, you know, my first boss in forensics just said, leave your ego at the door. If you leave your ego at the door, then it doesn't matter. You're just trying to help people. And if everybody disagrees with you, you know, so what? I mean, the danger comes from family members. I've had situations where my life's been threatened, and I've had police cars out the front of the house. One, just a single case, another involving an animal rights group. So, but I think if you're not splattered over the media at least 3 or 4 times badly in your career as a forensic pathologist, you're probably not doing it correctly. I found there were some Aboriginal bones found up at Mimili, and that was turned into me desecrating graves, even though we had the permission from the traditional landowners to examine them. It became a very political thing, and all sorts of you know, bad things happened with that. And yet, you know, what I did was absolutely. I wanted it inquested, so I could actually say I think not to investigate remains in the Aboriginal lands as well as you do anywhere else is racist. But I didn't get my time in court.
Well, thank you. I agree. I think that they lose out sometimes if we don't support Indigenous people in having a fair go. Please join me in thanking Professor Byard for an amazing talk.